On the morning of October 12, 1977, somewhere in the labyrinthine network of Moscow's underground sewer system, an American intelligence operative made a decision that would transform them into one of the Cold War's most enigmatic figures. The decision was simple in its desperation: go down, stay hidden, and survive. What followed was 40 days of existence in conditions that most people couldn't endure for 40 minutes, a span of time that would become the subject of speculation, myth, and whispered conversations within intelligence circles for decades to come. The operative's real name remains unknown. Their gender, their background, even their face, all of it lost to history or locked away in files that may never surface. What we know them by is a code name, and that code name is Marble. The story of Marble doesn't begin with official acknowledgement or declassified documents. It begins with silence, with gaps in the historical record, and with a single reference in a KGB internal document that surfaced decades later. The document, obtained by researchers after the fall of the Soviet Union when certain archives became briefly accessible, was a routine surveillance report dated October 1977. Most of it dealt with standard counterintelligence operations, the tracking of foreign diplomats and journalists, the kind of bureaucratic security work that filled thousands of such reports during the Cold War. But buried in the middle of the document was a brief notation: CIA codename Marble, Arbat district. That was it. No elaboration, no follow-up, just a codename. The American intelligence community has never commented on Marble. Not once. Not in declassified documents. Not in memoirs written by former officers. Not even in the careful, sanitized histories that agencies sometimes release decades after operations have concluded. The silence is absolute, which in the world of espionage often speaks louder than any official statement ever could. But the story didn't stay buried, because intelligence work, no matter how classified, leaves traces. It leaves witnesses. It leaves rumors that spread through diplomatic channels and eventually filter down to journalists, historians, and researchers who spend their lives piecing together the fragments of operations that were never supposed to be known. In the case of Marble, those fragments came from an unusual mix of sources. Eyewitness accounts from Moscow residents who saw something they couldn't quite explain, scattered Soviet news reports about unusual security operations in the fall of 1977, and years later, a discovery in the sewers that would reignite interest in what had become an urban legend. To understand what happened to Marble, you have to understand Moscow in 1977. The Cold War was at its height, and the Soviet Union's capital was one of the most surveilled cities on Earth. The KGB, the Soviet Union's Committee for State Security, operated with a level of thoroughness and paranoia that made intelligence work in Moscow a constant game of cat and mouse. Every foreign diplomat, every journalist, every businessman who entered the city was assumed to be a potential spy until proven otherwise, and even then, they were watched. The Americans stationed in Moscow, whether they worked at the embassy or operated under deeper cover, lived under the assumption that they were being followed at all times. Apartments were bugged, phone lines were tapped. Even seemingly innocent conversations in public spaces could be monitored by plainclothes agents or informants who blended seamlessly into the crowds. For a CIA operative working in that environment, the margin for error was nearly non-existent. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and you could find yourself identified, followed, and eventually apprehended. The consequences of being caught varied depending on the circumstances, but they were never good. At best, you'd be declared persona non grata and expelled from the country in a very public diplomatic incident. At worst, you'd disappear into the Soviet prison system, subjected to interrogation, and possibly used as a bargaining chip in some future exchange. And in the absolute worst cases, you simply vanished, your fate left to speculation and the cold calculations of geopolitical strategy. October 12, 1977, was a Wednesday. The weather in Moscow that day was overcast and cool, with temperatures hovering around 8 degrees Celsius. It was the kind of grey, damp autumn day that the city was known for, the kind that made people hurry along the streets with their collars turned up and their eyes fixed on the pavement. According to eyewitness accounts compiled years later, something unusual happened that morning in the Arbat district, a historic area of central Moscow known for its winding streets and mixture of old and new architecture. What started as routine surveillance turned into something much more dramatic, something that would be remembered and discussed in hushed tones by those who witnessed it. Multiple residents of the area, interviewed separately by researchers and journalists in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, reported seeing a man running through the streets near the old Arbat around mid-morning. The chase, because that's clearly what it was, played out across several blocks. The man being pursued moved with purpose, not blind panic, weaving through pedestrians and using the district's narrow side streets to his advantage. Behind him, witnesses reported seeing at least 3 or 4 other men, spread out but clearly coordinating their movements, the kind of organized pursuit that immediately signaled official involvement. These weren't street criminals or angry citizens chasing a thief. The way they moved, the way they communicated with brief gestures and maintained formation even as they navigated the crowds, it was professional, methodical, and unmistakably official. One witness, a woman who had been shopping for bread that morning, described the scene to a researcher in 1994. She said the man being chased passed within meters of her, close enough that she could see his face. She described him as neither young nor old, perhaps in his 30s, with dark hair. What struck her most, she said, was his expression. He wasn't wild-eyed with fear. His face was set in concentration, like someone solving a problem in real time. He glanced over his shoulder once as he passed her, calculated something, and then suddenly changed direction, ducking into an alley she knew led toward a cluster of older residential buildings. The pursuers followed seconds later, moving fast but not running in a way that would cause alarm. To most people on the street that morning, it might have looked like nothing more than men in a hurry, perhaps late for work or heading to some urgent appointment. But those who noticed the coordination, who saw the way they scanned the crowds and communicated with each other, understood that they were watching something significant unfold. The old woman with the bread said she stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, before deciding to follow at a distance, drawn by the same impulse that makes people slow down to look at accidents. What she witnessed next, she said, was something she'd never forgotten. The man being chased turned onto a quieter side street, one lined with older buildings. He moved along the street for perhaps 30 meters, his pursuers temporarily out of sight around the corner, and then he stopped at a storm drain grate. She watched him crouch down, then pull it open. The metal grating came up with a screech that she could hear even from her position. Then, without any hesitation, the man lowered himself feet first into the opening and disappeared into the darkness below. The woman said she froze, not understanding what she'd just witnessed. A moment later, the pursuers came around the corner, moving fast now, clearly aware they were close to losing their target. They reached the spot where the man had been and noticed the displaced grate. She said she saw them gather around the opening, peering down into it, having a brief, heated conversation in voices too low for her to hear. After a moment of discussion, one of them climbed down into the opening while the others remained on the surface, taking positions that allowed them to watch the surrounding area. That's when the woman decided she'd seen enough. She turned and walked away quickly. Her account was corroborated, at least in its essential details, by two other witnesses. An elderly man who had been walking his dog that morning saw the tail end of the chase and watched the pursuers gather around the storm drain. A younger man, a university student at the time, had been cutting through the side street and saw the entire sequence from a different angle. Their descriptions of the man varied slightly. One remembered him as tall, another as average height, but they all agreed on the core facts. Someone had been chased through the Arbat district by what appeared to be KGB agents, and that person had escaped by descending into Moscow's sewer system. All three witnesses said they never reported what they'd seen to the authorities, because in 1977, Moscow, inserting yourself into what was clearly a state security matter, was a good way to create problems for yourself that you didn't need. The storm drain that the man entered that morning was part of Moscow's extensive underground sewer system, a network of tunnels and channels that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the city. The system had been expanded and modernized over the decades, but large sections of it dated back to pre-revolutionary times, and navigating it without detailed knowledge of its layout would have been nearly impossible. The tunnels varied in size from large main channels that a person could walk through upright to narrow pipes that required crawling. They were dark, cold, and filled with the constant sound of running water and the echo of dripping condensation. The air quality ranged from merely unpleasant to actively dangerous, depending on the location and the time of year. In October, with temperatures dropping and rain becoming more frequent, the system would have been particularly inhospitable. What happened next played out largely hidden from public view, but the signs of it were visible to anyone who knew what to look for. In the days following October 12th, residents of the Arbat district and surrounding areas began noticing unusual activity around the city's underground infrastructure. Utility workers, or men dressed as utility workers, were seen opening manholes and storm drains, shining lights down into the darkness. Vehicles marked with city maintenance logos were parked at various locations, sometimes for hours at a time, while men in coveralls came and went. The activity wasn't constant or obvious enough to cause widespread alarm, but it was persistent, and it followed a pattern. They were searching. Soviet news reports from late October and early November make no mention of a manhunt in Moscow's sewers, which is exactly what you'd expect. The KGB didn't announce their operations, especially not operations that involved the pursuit of foreign intelligence operatives on Soviet soil. But there are other indicators, subtle mentions in the press, that take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of what eyewitnesses reported. On October 15th, a brief article in Moskovskaya Pravda mentioned that sections of the city's sewer system would be undergoing emergency maintenance over the coming weeks, and that residents might notice increased activity from municipal workers in certain districts. On October 23rd, another article noted that city officials were conducting comprehensive safety inspections of underground infrastructure following concerns about structural integrity. The articles were mundane, the kind of bureaucratic announcements that fill the back pages of city newspapers, but their timing and the vagueness of their explanations suggest they were cover stories for something else. Moscow residents, interviewed decades later, remembered the activity. One man, who lived in an apartment building near the Arbat in 1977, said he distinctly recalled a period of several weeks when there seemed to be maintenance workers around the neighborhood constantly. He said he'd wake up in the morning and see vehicles parked on his street, men in coveralls going down into the manholes, and he remembered thinking it was strange because nothing ever seemed to get fixed. There were no visible improvements. The activity just continued day after day. Another woman remembered her husband, who worked for the city's water department, mentioning that there had been some kind of priority operation in the central district, that crews were being pulled from their regular assignments to assist with something that he wasn't allowed to discuss. If the man who descended into that storm drain was indeed the operative codenamed Marble, then what we're talking about is someone who had to evade not just passive surveillance, but an active, systematic search of the underground system. The KGB would have approached this methodically. They knew someone had gone down, and they knew that eventually that person would have to come up, either to escape the city or simply because survival in the sewers for any extended period was nearly impossible. The search would have focused on mapping the exits, monitoring the access points, and gradually working through the tunnel system section by section. They would have used everything at their disposal: diagrams of the sewer layout, workers familiar with the underground infrastructure, possibly even dogs trained to track scents in difficult environments. For Marble, surviving those first few days would have been about staying ahead of the search, moving deeper into the system whenever the sounds of pursuit got too close, finding places to hide when flashlight beams swept through the tunnels. The physical challenges were immense. Water was the first priority, and in a sewer system, finding drinkable water is paradoxically one of the hardest tasks. The water flowing through the channels is contaminated, dangerous, capable of causing illness that in those conditions could be fatal. But Moscow's underground also included access to the city's freshwater infrastructure, pipes carrying drinking water to buildings and public facilities. If Marble had any knowledge of the system's layout, if they'd done any preparation before the operation went wrong, they might have known where to find those access points. Condensation on walls and pipes could also be collected, though the amount would be minimal and the process time-consuming. Every decision about when to drink, how much to drink, had to be weighed against the risk of dehydration versus the risk of exposure while accessing water sources. Food is even more complicated. There's no food in a sewer system unless you bring it with you, and the likelihood that Marble had more than minimal supplies when they went underground is slim. This was an operative running from active pursuit, not someone embarking on a planned expedition. Whatever they had in their pockets, perhaps some emergency rations, would have been gone within the first week. After that, it would have been a matter of enduring hunger, of watching the body slowly consume itself, breaking down muscle and fat to keep vital organs functioning. The human body can survive for weeks without food, as long as it has water, but the physical deterioration is profound. Strength fades, reaction time slows. The ability to think clearly becomes compromised. Every day without food makes the next day harder, the next decision more difficult. The cold would have been relentless. October in Moscow means temperatures that can drop near freezing, and underground, away from any source of warmth, the cold becomes a constant, penetrating presence. The tunnels would have been damp, and damp cold is far more dangerous than dry cold because it leaches body heat much faster. Without proper clothing or any way to stay dry, hypothermia becomes a very real threat. Marble would have needed to keep moving when possible to generate body heat, but movement burns calories that they couldn't afford to lose. It's an impossible equation with no good solution, just a constant balancing act between staying warm enough to avoid hypothermia and conserving enough energy to last another day, another week, however long it took for the search to end. The psychological dimension might have been even more challenging than the physical one. Days turning into weeks in complete darkness, no sunlight, no natural sense of time, no contact with the outside world. The isolation, the sensory deprivation, the constant fear of discovery, these are conditions that break people. Former operatives and soldiers who've endured similar experiences have spoken about the mental strategies required for survival. Breaking time into manageable segments, creating routines to maintain structure, focusing on specific tasks to keep the mind occupied. But even with training and discipline, prolonged isolation in hostile conditions pushes human psychology to its limits. Marble would have had to fight not just against the environment, but against their own mind, against despair, against the voices that would have whispered that surrender might be better than another day in the dark. The search continued through October and into November. The pattern of activity around the city's underground infrastructure persisted, though it may have become less intense as days passed without any sign of the fugitive. The KGB faced a fundamental problem. The Moscow sewer system was vast, and one person who knew how to stay hidden could evade even a determined search if they were disciplined and careful. The tunnels connected to each other in complex ways. There were sections that hadn't been mapped in detail. There were access points that led to other underground systems, utility tunnels, old drainage channels, abandoned sections from previous eras of construction. It was like searching for someone in a dark, flooded maze that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath one of the world's largest cities. But searches can't continue indefinitely. Resources are finite. Personnel have other duties. At some point, the calculation changes from "we will find this person" to "the likelihood of finding them" doesn't justify the continued expenditure of resources. For Marble, if they could just survive long enough, if they could stay hidden long enough, eventually the active search would be scaled back. Guards might remain at key exit points, passive surveillance might continue, but the teams of men going down into the tunnels with flashlights and dogs would be reassigned to other operations. It becomes a waiting game, and the question becomes who breaks first: the hunter who gives up, or the hunted who can no longer endure. On November 21st, 1977, exactly 40 days after the chase through the Arbat district, something changed. Residents who had grown accustomed to seeing maintenance vehicles and crews around the neighborhood noticed that the activity suddenly stopped. The vehicles disappeared. The men in coveralls were gone. The manholes that had been opened and monitored for weeks were sealed again and left undisturbed. It was as if someone had made a decision, given an order, and the entire operation had been wound down overnight. One resident, interviewed in the late 1990s, said he remembered the shift because it was so abrupt. One day there were workers on his street, the next day there was nothing, and his neighborhood returned to normal as if the previous weeks had never happened. Why the search was called off so suddenly is something we can only speculate about. Perhaps the KGB concluded that whoever had gone underground had died down there, that 40 days in those conditions without surfacing made survival unlikely. Perhaps there were political considerations, other priorities that demanded attention and resources. Perhaps there was pressure from higher up to end an operation that had consumed significant manpower without results. Or perhaps they knew something that has never become public, received information that suggested the operative was no longer in the sewer system or no longer in Moscow. Without access to KGB records and the relevant files, if they still exist, we're left to read meaning into the timing of events and the fragments of information that have emerged over the years. What happened in the days immediately after the search was called off is where the story becomes even more speculative. There are scattered reports, unreliable and impossible to verify, of a figure being seen near the Moskva River in late November. The river cuts through Moscow, and the sewer system empties into it at various points through large drainage outlets. Several people, interviewed years later, claimed they saw someone emerging from one of these outlets late one night, someone who moved quickly along the riverbank and disappeared into the darkened streets. The descriptions are vague. Again, we're talking about memories from decades ago, filtered through time and the natural unreliability of eyewitness testimony, but they're consistent in the basic details. Someone came out of the drainage system near the river, and whoever it was didn't want to be seen. After that, marble vanishes from any record entirely. There's no evidence of apprehension, no diplomatic incident, no body discovered. The KGB document that mentioned the codename has no follow-up entries, no notation about the outcome of the search or the fate of the operative. The American intelligence community has maintained absolute silence, offering neither confirmation nor denial of the operation, the operative, or the outcome. Marble becomes a ghost, a name attached to a story that exists in the space between verified history and persistent rumor. The discovery in 1993 added a new layer to the mystery, though it raised more questions than it answered. During routine maintenance work in a section of the Moscow sewer system near the Arbat district, workers found a waterproof pouch wedged into a crevice in the tunnel wall. The pouch had deteriorated significantly, but its contents, several pages of paper, had been partially protected from the worst of the moisture. The pages were turned over to Russian authorities, and eventually, after the Cold War ended and certain types of information began flowing more freely between former adversaries, details about the discovery filtered out to researchers and journalists. The pages were nearly illegible. Water damage, mold, and years of exposure to the harsh underground environment had reduced most of the writing to smudged, unreadable stains. But there were fragments, isolated words, and letters that could still be made out, and crucially, they appeared to be in English. One page had what looked like the partial word day visible near the top, though whether it said Monday, day 1, or something else entirely was impossible to determine. Another fragment showed what might have been wa, followed by illegible smearing, which could have been water or could have been something completely different. A third page had scattered letters, T, R, N, that might once have been part of words or sentences, but were now isolated marks on ruined paper. The significance of the discovery isn't in what the pages said, because they said nothing coherent enough to constitute information. The significance is in what they suggested, that at some point, someone had been in that section of the sewer system, someone who wrote in English, someone who felt the need to document something on paper and preserve it in a waterproof pouch. The location where the pouch was found was consistent with the area where marble had been seen entering the storm drain. The time frame of the paper's deterioration, as estimated by Russian forensic experts, was consistent with documents that had been underground since the late 1970s. None of this proves anything definitively, but it adds weight to the story, transforms it from pure rumor into something that might actually have happened. Russian authorities, for their part, acknowledged the discovery but offered no interpretation of what it meant. The pages were photographed, catalogued, and presumably filed away in some archive. American intelligence officials, when asked about the discovery by journalists in the mid-1990s, declined to comment, maintaining the same wall of silence they'd maintained since the beginning. The pages themselves have never been made fully public. What exists in the historical record are descriptions from researchers who were allowed to view them briefly, photograph that show water-stained paper with fragments of text, and the ongoing debate about whether they constitute evidence of Marble's time underground or whether they're an unrelated artifact that coincidentally fits the story. The question of what happened to Marble after they left Moscow, assuming they did leave Moscow, is one that has no satisfactory answer. If they made contact with handlers after escaping the sewers, it's plausible they were moved out through one of the established exfiltration routes to the Baltic states or Finland. If they were successfully extracted, they would have been debriefed, given a new identity, and relocated far from intelligence work. But there are darker possibilities. Perhaps they made it out of the sewers but couldn't reach an extraction point. The physical toll of 40 days underground, leaving them too weak to navigate the final stage of escape. Perhaps they were caught in the search, quietly arrested, and disappeared into the Soviet prison system. Or perhaps they simply died from exposure or illness, their body never found in the vast, dark network beneath the city. The absence of any American acknowledgement is perhaps the most telling aspect of the story. The CIA has never confirmed that the operative existed, never provided any context for the codename that appeared in the KGB document. What we do know is that someone went into the Moscow sewer system and could have survived 40 days in conditions that would have killed most people within a week. Someone could have evaded one of the most powerful security services in history, outlasted a systematic search of one of the world's most challenging urban environments. And perhaps after 40 days, they actually made it out, or at least disappeared so completely that 40-plus years later, we still don't know for certain what their fate was.